Okay, I would like to call the meeting to order at 5 p.m. For the audience here tonight, the City of Glendora utilizes a hybrid meeting format to allow for participation both in person and virtually. In consideration of others and the business conducted tonight, please silence your phones and any electronic devices and refrain from speaking unless recognized. Again, this is a public meeting for the community of Glendora. We appreciate and respect your participation here this evening. Madam Clerk, will you please call roll call?
Thank you, President. At this time, I will conduct an oral roll call and request that each trustee respond with present when their name is called. Trustee Chu?
Present.
Trustee Flowers?
Present.
Trustee Tolan?
Present.
Vice President Johnson?
Present.
President Landman?
Present.
Let the record show all members are present. Thank you.
I would like to ask Reed and Will Johnson to come up and lead us with the pledge.
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Read. I'd like to start the special items, discussion of library structural assessment, visioning, and funding options. PowerPoint. So, I would like to invite Library Director Janet Stone to present the PowerPoint.
We'll take the staff report first and then public comment. Thank you for that clarification. Excuse the sidebar there. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this discussion of the library's structural assessment, its visioning work, and some funding options regarding both of those. A quick overview of what we'll be doing this evening. First of all, we'll be talking a little bit about the history of the current library building. Then we'll talk about the possibilities for a library building that could serve another 35 to 50 years. And finally, talk a little bit about the political and fiscal environment in which we find ourselves.
Good evening. Thanks for having me here. I'll give the first part of the presentation, talks a little bit about the history, a little bit about the city's fiscal abilities back in the late 60s and early 70s, then sort of talk about where things are at today based on law that was passed in the late 1970s. So if we take a look at the library in and of itself and look back to funding or trying to find the location it's currently in, there was a vote in 1955. Cities at that time had the ability either to raise taxes themselves or go out for a vote and to build a new library. And are you ready for it? For $185,000. That vote failed, 32% yes, 68% no. 10 years later, the city went out for another bond to build the police library, the police department, which is the current building that exists now. And that vote passed 86% yes and 14% no. The cost of that facility and that was bonded was almost $800,000. The actual cost for the land acquisition and design was a little more than that. So in the city of Glendora in the late 60s, 68, 67, there is momentum that picks up for a new library. In fact, if you go back and look at the news articles and the council minutes and meetings throughout the city's history, there is an expansion of this city hall space in 1912 and again in 1922. In fact, if you look at the original blueprints of this facility, there's actually a library where the finance department is, where you pay your water bill now. City Hall Annex that we're currently in is built in 1930. And after the vote fails, there's an expansion funded by the Bidwell family in 1955, which is just past that door over to your left. in 68 and 69 in the city of Glendora, there's a great deal of growth, largely through annexations, which we'll show a little bit later. And again, the conversation starts to come that the library needs additional space. There's material heavy at that time, right? There's no laptops. People aren't walking around looking at, virtual resources. The library, and a lot of what you came to do at the library, was a physical space. In fact, many times you see the figures of where the city thought it was heading. And in the city's 1990 general plan, which is developed in the late 60s, we estimate that the population is going to grow from 30,000 to 80,000 people by 1990. And in fact, we think the student enrollment will increase from a little over 9,000 to a little more than 25,000, which is quite staggering if you understand where we're at today. In fact, there is an excerpt here from a 1968 letter from the then city manager to the then superintendent of Glendora Unified School District, talking about the need to potentially explore expansion of the library, that the city projects and the school district projects this growth from 9,000 students to 25,000. Of those 25,000, about 21,000 would be within the city's boundaries at that time. So further discussion occurs at the city, and in February of 1969, the city council gives the approval of the city manager to apply for state grants for new funding for a library, which is a process we just went through here as well. And the ability to call for a special election for a library bond should the city receive this grant for $785,000. In September of 1969, there is a course change. Believe it or not, we're currently in an environment where there's some political or some legal unknowing about what future tax structure looks like. In November of 24, there are actually 3 items that will be a statewide election that represent constitutional amendments about changing a vote. Is it 50+1? Is it 2/3 for property? And at this time, in 1969, they have the same exact questions. It's just sort of one of those things where we are where we were then, and the city council hits pause on the bond aspect and directs the city to continue to move forward with the possibility to build a new library, and continues work with an architect at that time. In November, late 1969, the city is notified that they are going to deny funding at a state level. At that time, the state received money from the feds. The feds said they were out of money, and for 2 straight years for all library construction, the state said we're out of money. City changed course from a 33,000 square foot facility to the current 28,000 square foot facility that we have now. And estimated costs at that time had already increased in that brief period of time to $1.1 million. This includes construction, land acquisition, all drawings, and furniture. To give you some idea today, the same cost for a similar size library could be about $50 million or more. That's an increase of about 11,000% from where we were in 1969. It's really interesting to note that at that time, there are several newspaper articles that anticipates this library will serve the community for the next 35 years. So we're well past that, but at that time, and if you look at how things were built in the 60s and 70s, that's about the useful life of a building at that time. Building a new library, though, without a vote was not without its political challenges. In fact, Miss Everett Kloutman put forward an initiative to require the city to go out to vote instead of changing its property taxes. Again, this is pre-Prop 13. It required 1,376 signatures to cause the vote. She gathered just about 240 signatures shy of that total. This effort was supported by 1 council member at that time. In July of 1970, the school district is fully engaged with the city on how to build a new library. The 2 entities create what's known as the Glendora Library Authority, which is a joint powers authority, which has the ability to issue debt. And so because of growing school population, declines in state funding for schools, I'm sure this all sounds very familiar, same as it ever was. they agreed to enter into this relationship for building a new library. In order to fund the new library through this joint powers authority, the city enters into a lease agreement. So while the city is a part of the JPA, which has the legal ability to issue debt, the city itself is technically a separate legal entity and promises to cover the debt service, which ends up being about $81,000 annually. And this arrangement is done through a lease agreement. So in November of 1970, the city issues $950,000 in bonds through Bank of America. The rate is just under 7% for 30 years, and the annual debt service payment of $81,000 continues up until I believe it's 1997 before they are paid off. So, but a little bit about how the city's able to fund this. So again, way back when, without all the environmental requirements, groundbreaking happens the same month that the bonds are issued, and the grand opening happens a little more than 14 months later. So wish we still had those same timelines in the world in which we live, but it was magic back then for sure. So a little bit how we got to a growing population. Here is a series of maps. The first one is here's the incorporation in 1911 with the city, whopping 700 residents. By 1950, we have almost 4,000. As you know, we've added some additional space, including a cemetery and some outlying areas. However, by 1960, as you can tell by the map here, there's significant growth to 20,000. So this is the time the library expansion conversation starts happening. And 10 years later, if you notice, the city's sphere of influence is much larger, the incorporated area is much larger, populations increased by a third at that time to 31,000. So all these projections that they're talking about in future growth are really consideration of building in the foothills, building everywhere, adding a lot more space. The city really contemplated, it's crazy to think, more than doubling the size from this point forward over the next 20 years. This will look much more familiar to you in 1980 to 38,000. And by the year 2000, which is a very similar map, we're at 49,000. The last annexation occurs in 2013. And according to the state of California, as of 2023, we have 51,159 residents, which is actually a slight decrease from our peak in 2020, according to the census. So while we look around in California, I think it's important to remember that, you know, in California, we're right in the middle in terms of city size, but there are approximately 19,500 cities in the United States, and the city of Glendora is one of the 800th largest cities in the United States. So always important to keep perspective when we're talking about the amenities we not only provide to our residents and our community, but those around us as well. So there's a really interesting article from the San Gabriel Tribune in 1969, and it talks about how the library was funded. And there's a quote from the city manager in there. It says, "The library is financed through a joint powers agreement between the city and school district. The library was a result of funds, and the funding was a result of funds saved when the city's fire department was merged with the county. The city's savings of $120,000 annually will go towards the completing payments of the library." And so as we've talked a little bit before, is this accurate? Well, the answer is yes and no, depending on what perspective you're looking for. But I can assure you one thing was correct. The homeowners did not see decreased costs for their property tax. So I want to go through a couple charts before you that talks about the budget and funding and how things worked in the late 60s and early 70s. And we'll have two of these charts. So the percentages you see on the left are a percentage of property values. So the city, believe it or not, didn't just have a general fund it collected property taxes in. It had a library fund, a parks and recreation fund, a state retirement fund for CalPERS, and the library bond that we saw that was passed in 1965. In addition to those things, the county, through its fire contract, also had a little more than a 0.65%. So on the city side, the city was collecting as a portion of property tax about 1.38% of total taxes. We've highlighted the library amount on there, 0.17 of 1%. So to put this in perspective, the city, towards its general obligations and retirement, was collecting 1.38% in 1968-69. Today, as a result of Prop 13 and other tax measures, the city receives less than 1/10 of 1% in total. So a much, much lower percentage today than we did back then. And I might add, just for frame of reference, the city was also receiving sales tax at this time, which was about 30% more than property tax. Just to kind of put it in perspective. So property tax was not the number one revenue. The city still received a pretty significant portion of sales tax. So all in between fire and the city, you're about a little more than 2% of property values and assessed valuation. So as you'll note here, as we go to the next area in 71, 72, the city begins to issue debt for the library through the Joint Powers Authority. And as you'll note, the percentage of the library goes up from 0.17 all the way up to 0.3%. That increased assessment is what's used to pay the debt service on the revenue bonds that the city and school district issued. Also look on the bottom, when the city said it saved money by merging the fire department, what really happened was the increased cost went to the public. The fire contract became from a 0.1 or 0.65 of 1% to a little more than about 3/4 of 1%. So the decrease that the city paid out of its general fund was made up through the fire assessment. So while the city's overall taxing percentage stayed the same, the impact to the residents increased, and this was what was allowed prior to the passage of Prop 13. Just because doing this research is always fascinating, I apologize for the quality here, but there's an excerpt here. And from 67 to 68 to 71, 72, the city manager here is complaining a little bit that costs over, that 4-year period have more than doubled for certain areas like the police department. However, property tax revenue over the same period only went up 45%. I'll tell you this, if our property tax revenue went up 45% over 4 years, we would have no complaints on potholes. We'd have no conversation on needing a new library facility or new parks or anything. All that would be funded. So it's always, people like to say, well, we did things different back then. I'm like, well, you had 40% increase in revenue back then. So of course you could. So it's always good to keep perspective for how things were to how things are now. But it wouldn't be Glendora if we did not take every chance to brag about our low property tax rate. So while I know that we talked about changes on property tax, and we'll talk about Prop 13 a little bit about how much more you paid as a percentage of your property tax, and this is before we had a huge inflation of property values, Glendora was still relatively low. So to put that in context, our general fund revenue for property tax right now is like 20 million. Let's just call it 20 million, a little less than that. If we would have had the same percentages we had in 68, 69, that would be 125 million a year. So when we look back at this synopsis from 71 and 72, Glendora at 1.38%, not counting fire, is in the bottom third of a lot of the cities in the San Gabriel Valley. In fact, we're tied with Dougherty and just ahead of Arcadia, and then Rosemead and El Monte are the lowest. Claremont and San Dimas are leading the way at about 2 to 2.3%. So it's always good to keep perspective. So even though it seemed like a lot of money that was coming in, the city of Glendora still prided itself on being fiscally responsible. So one of the fun things that we found during research, what was new for me, is everyone knows Prop 13, but what many people don't know is Prop 9. So in Prop 9, which looks very similar to Prop 13, there was a proposition to limit property tax to 1%, which is very similar to the concept under Prop 13. However, it failed in 1968 by a vote of 32% yes and about 68% no. What is really interesting, and I think what I would like to read, is the city of Glendora takes an official position to oppose a limitation on tax. And in fact, in 1968, they state, whereas it is the opinion of the Glendora City Council that the proposed amendment is an irresponsible approach to the problem of tax reform. In part, it misleads the public into believing there will be a tax decrease when in fact a massive tax shift requiring a significant state tax increase will result. The state income tax would have tripled, the state sales tax quadrupled to cover the revenue shortfall created by this measure. The bonding capacity of the city of Glendora would be limited so that no further bonds can be issued to finance future city construction on a pay-as-you-go basis, which is exactly what they did to build both the library and the police department. I would add that Prop 13, 10 years exactly later, passes by about the same percentage it fails. And what we have seen since then, and not to get on the political side, is a huge increase in other ways where counties and the city had, and school districts, quite frankly, had to make up revenue in other ways, which is the expansion of gas taxes and special taxes and sales taxes to make up that. In fact, since Prop 13, cities have still tried to maintain the gap of funding that was created since then. And with that, turn it over to Janet for a little more of the actual facility, but always important to provide some background.
Thank you very much. So to say that gentleman needs no introduction is true. However, I should have introduced you.
Oh.
So yes, so for those of you who might not be aware, that's Adam Raymond, our city manager. Thank you very much for covering all of that. So we're moving on now to a little bit more about the current library building from its current structural status. And it's fair to say that there have been some ongoing building related issues, including structural deficiencies and some water intrusion. We'll be talking a little bit more about those. So first of all, primarily because we were looking at some shade structure options for the plaza that is also serves as the roof of the main floor of the library. There was a preliminary structural assessment done in 2021 to decide if any of that shade structure solution was possible. And as part of that, it was there were some notes made about the visible cracking in the beams inside the library. So in 2023, a company called Myers, Houghton and Partners, MHP, we'll refer to them as MHP, was contracted to perform some more in-depth structural analysis. And there were two parts to that. One was the structural part, and one was some visioning activities that helped them cost out options for how the library might be expanded upon. So as far as the structural analyses from MHP, a few things. First of all, really seismic strengthening they decided was not warranted other than some wall anchorage upgrades. But generally, seismic is not the issue. There is some what they called minor to moderate cracking throughout the library's main roof structure, which of course also serves as the plaza. We know that the plaza waterproofing membrane that keeps the water from soaking through from the plaza down into the library may be compromised. We see daily proof of that when it is raining. And also there are some issues with girders and pad footings regarding the live load and soil bearing pressure. So there are definitely concerns. So the recommendations that came out of those findings are that there are significant retrofitting and repairs needed. At the moment, the Bidwell Plaza, which again serves as the roof of the library, is okay for passive use. It can be walked across and that sort of thing. It is currently not being used for public assembly events of more than 500 people with equipment. And that's conservative based on the restrictions that were provided, that were suggested to us, just to err on the side of safety. And then of course, the recommendation that if we really want to address the raining inside of the library, that a waterproofing consultant should be retained in the future. So on the programmatic side, there is one of the reasons that we hired MHP is because they not only said they could talk to us about the seismic safety of the building, but they also came to the table and said for us to be able to suggest what it's going to cost to add or improve the library, we need to know what you want to do with it. And so they held these visioning workshops. So they called this the evaluation of the feasibility of vertical expansion of the building. And basically, as part of that, they worked with several groups of library stakeholders to figure out the intended use of the space. The way they did that was with an architectural consultant across 7 workshops, and participants included folks from MHP, from the library staff, the Board of Library Trustees, the Glendora Public Library Friends Foundation, City Manager's Office, and Public Works Department. So sort of a mini representative community visioning. So some of the initial inputs that we provided included the library's current strategic framework, some projected population and per capita square footage allocations. So the consultant said that the library, which is about 30,000 square feet, probably to serve this population, we could expect to expand it to 45,000 to 52.5. So, you can really think about it as a roughly 20,000 square foot expansion. And then they also did an environmental scan for us as well. So the programmatic visioning, among other things, produced a proposal of the library building spaces of the future. So they did the environmental scan, and then we responded with some observations about where we thought the library spaces of the future were going. So we'll just go mention those very quickly. Among them, and some of these, by the way, I will say as we go through this list, do not have an exact analog in the current library. We probably try to use the library for all of these things, but we have not consciously dedicated space to all of them. So the various kinds of spaces include the customer driven workspace, which is basically where the community has the opportunity to come and build their own projects, bring their own equipment, have space to accomplish their goals. Public assembly spaces, these are gathering spaces where meetings and parties and agendas can be planned and training can be conducted by the public in spaces that get checked out like other library resources. Library mediated public workspace, which is different from the customer driven side, which is these are spaces designed with equipment and with expertise provided by the library or contracted by the library to help train and fill gaps in the community's aspirations with a specific intent and direction, as opposed to being where the customers bring their own work processes. Fulfillment center services. This is the backstage stuff where this is how we get the content for the public into the hands of the public. And this is the way this happens is changing in our current world. So it is very much like a fulfillment center that you hear of with retail. And needs to serve a lot of different purposes in terms of preparing items, not only to go out on the shelves, but also possibly to be shipped and that sort of thing. So it's a different shift to that in the future. Small private and semi-private spaces. We really have a tough time keeping up with demand for this. And people need a chance to come and work, one-on-one or in small groups together, as well as in those large public assembly spaces. The physical content showroom, this applies to not only the traditional collections for the public, but also others that might change over the next 35 to 50 years, including public art, including different technology petting zoos, all sorts of things where we need to be able to show off and give the public physical access to different resources. Some others include leisure spaces. It is important to have this third place where you can go and just chill out in this age of information overload. Library services, those are the actual interaction points between the staff and the public. Those need to be planned with intent so that they are where the customers need them inside the library and provide the best access to services. There are some, additional things like the preservation and archival storage for our protection of Glendora's historic resources, public access technologies, possibly food service, event catering spaces, that kind of thing. And then some, obviously got to have a miscellaneous category for things that we haven't anticipated yet, the uncharted possibilities, and then infrastructure, things like storage space and janitor space and restrooms and so on and so forth, HVAC systems and so on. Okay, so one thing I want to mention before we move on is that those spaces are were carefully designated. But the thing I think to carry away from that list is that we expect the ratios of what we need for each of the spaces to change over the next few years and certainly over decades of a library building. So the key is not to start out by saying we are going to have, always going to have this amount of space for public assembly, but to say we're going to start with that, with a certain amount based on certain predictors when the library or its expansion reopens. But but be able to change that as the needs of the public occur. So not to create this kind of legacy space that's locked in place. So I wanted to show you some images from this was a library that was introduced to us by the architectural consultants. It is up in Canada, and I just thought it was a great example, sort of going in from the micro out to the macro, so you can see how this might work. So this is an example of a close-up of a makerspace in this library in Edmonton. It's the Milner branch up there. And so you can see that, you know, just this close up of this hands-on space. But if you pull back, you can see where this space takes place in this larger library arena that is clearly very flexible. You can see how those spaces can be made and changed inside this larger space, which also has this wonderful openness to the rest of the city out through those great windows. So you can also put into that same kind of space. These are a variety. These pictures are from different sources, but they're all of that same branch. So here's another way. I mean, you can put in shelving in places, move that around. You can create interior meeting spaces like this one. Again, same library. You can create small spaces for people to work individually. You can create magical and in very environmental spaces like this one for children. So all of that can happen inside of one flexible space, as you've seen in this particular library. I would like to say this was a common approach, but there weren't many that I saw that were like this. So I just wanted to show you what that might look like. It's worth mentioning that the architectural consultants also did do a lot of study of the current building on their own. And I think they may have walked it with our management analyst, Elke Cathell, but out of that, they pulled what they called a roast of the current building. It was done with love, very friendly, but it's worth pointing out what they noticed was it was a challenge of the challenges of the current building. So I pointed out the windows in one of those images. They pointed out that there's really no visibility of the activities happening inside the library when you're outside the library. There's no welcome, no draw to come in and take and participate in this gathering place. It's hard. It's not intuitive on how to get into the library. There are several areas of the library where it would fail to meet current code if it were being built now. The electrical connectivity is inadequate, things like the placement of the outlets and ability to charge devices and that sort of thing. Temperature control and ventilation pose challenges in this big space that has been subsequently subdivided, but not the HVAC hasn't been changed. Water leaks, as we know, have been persistent pretty much since the library opened. We have records of it, at least in the first few years right after it opened. Lighting systems are outdated. Those should be upgraded. They commented that the library workspace is small, overcrowded, no natural daylight in the office spaces. And it's clear that there's a shortage of storage space because you can see where we are keeping things in corners of the public areas that, just to find a place to put them. So those are the things that they noticed. And I do want to say also that they did comment that given all of this, that the library itself was very welcoming when you come in, well organized. And I want to give a shout out to staff because they commented that they thought the staff really did a great job of making the library welcoming and usable given all of these challenges. All right. So again, what they were doing was not these are not plans for the next library. These are not that kind of thing that you're about to see. What all of this was about was to try and make a concrete idea of what the library would be doing and therefore be able to cost out what those options would be. And so these are just concepts. Nobody missed out on any planning of the next library. They're just ideas that allowed them to figure costs. So I'll show you a couple of them tonight. The first one that they proposed is called the deck. And this one puts a second story over the existing plaza and also a two-story addition over on the Glendora Avenue side. This is, just under 21 million is their estimate for this. And this is just a model of what that would look like. You can see that where the plaza still is there, but now it's 2 stories and there's more of a building area on the Glendora Avenue side. And here is what that would look like from Glendora Avenue. So again, and I should mention that these are not intended to be architectural renderings. For example, from what they showed us and from their roast that they believe in windows, and they did not add anything like that to these. These are just sort of blocks to show you the shape and mass of the building. They didn't add anything like this, like the all the glass frontage that would be there on Glendora Avenue to welcome people into the activities happening inside the library. So that's one option. Another is what they call the Paseo concept. And this one has basically 3 blocks. One, again, that extends toward Glendora Avenue. Another one that extends south into partway into what's now the police station parking lot. And then the third block is sort of in between them. It's kind of an atrium-like space. And this one is around 23 million. Again, these are just estimates. So this is what that would look like from that same kind of model angle. And you can see where that addition has occurred out toward Glendora Avenue and toward the south. The police department would be sort of in the upper right-hand corner of this image here. And then here's what this one, again, without the windows and the architectural finishes, this is what that would look like from Glendora Avenue. So those are just a couple of ways, for example, that given what we said we wanted the building to be able to do over the next few decades, these are a couple of ways they thought that could happen given the existing footprint of the building. Okay, so in terms of options for what can be done to the current library, they range from the structural to infrastructure to remodeling to modernization. And what we're looking at here is a table that was created by Public Works back in May when the city was planning to apply for a state grant for funds to help renovate the building or at least repair the building. So this shows you the range of costs of various things from just mechanical, electrical, plumbing on its own, all the way up to a complete replacement of the structure itself. And I would say that the suggestions that the architectural consultants made as part of the MHP report really slot right into these as far as second story expansions and that sort of thing. So they were right in line with that. If you did the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the basic structural repairs and the weatherproofing, that project would be between 7.5 and 8 million, right around in there somewhere. Okay, so a little bit about the political and fiscal environment in which we find ourselves. I mentioned that grant that the city was planning to apply for back in May. They did indeed do so for part of the funds for that roughly $8 million project. That's called the Building Forward Grant, and we were not selected for funding at this time, as the letter said, I quote, wasn't among the facilities with the highest poverty levels as determined by the California Poverty Measure. So that was the result there. Also, things that have happened since May. In October, the Glendora Unified School District Board had a meeting. They received a presentation about some surveying they had done regarding some fundraising of their own. And as you can see on the left, the result was that, as I quote, nearly 6 in 10 voters supported a potential measure to provide funds for classroom repairs, upgrades, and safety improvements for the Unified School District, up 10 points from when they had surveyed in May of 2020. The conclusions at the presentation was that it was worthy of future planning and consideration. There was no action taken that night. This is something that they are continuing to explore. So to my knowledge, no decisions have been made about this, but this was how it was reported out to them at the school board. All right, so some funding options that are out there include citizen-initiated funding measures, city-initiated ones, what the approval requirements are like for those, and then just some other considerations that have come up, and we just wanted to make sure we were able to mention them. So city-initiated funding. according to the city's legal team, there is precedent for this. It's a group of citizens that propose it. For example, a special property tax by initiative. It does require a majority vote. It takes about a year. Signature gathering period is 6 months. And among other things to look out for on this one is the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, otherwise known as the Taxpayer Act. Among other things, this proposes requiring 2/3 for anything like this, as opposed to majority vote. There is some, the courts will be looking at this and possibly pulling it. So it's really up in the air right now. It's just, like I said, a watch list item that may impact whether or not this the majority vote would be a real factor here with the citizen initiated funding. For city initiated funding, this could be at a special or general election. We'll talk about the approval requirements in just a moment. This also has a watch list item in a constitutional amendment. And this one, excuse me for just a moment. I'm gonna pull up my notes on this, make sure I get it right. This one would allow, would allow the same 55% vote for public infrastructure and affordable housing. It's slated to be on the ballot next year, and it would apply to parcel taxes, sales and use taxes, general obligation bonds, and so on and so forth. So that's another one to watch for that might change the approval requirements for city initiated funding, allowing a 55% vote for those. Still up in the air. So here is a table. I've just chunked it into pieces so it's easy to read, that talks about the different voter approval rates that are needed for a variety of different kinds of measures. So city or county general taxes, these are if they're unrestricted purposes. So obviously that means that you can't say these are only going to go for the library, that they're unrestricted. Then we're looking at the far right column here to know that that is going to require just a majority vote, generally speaking. Then for special taxes where the uses are specified, and for school or special district taxes, general obligation bonds, other kinds of general obligation bonds, those, as you can see from the far right column, those require a 2/3 voter approval as opposed to majority. And then finally, there are some other property assessments and property related fees. In some cases, for property assessments, the majority of the affected property owners, and that's a voted weight. For property related fees, again, it's a 2/3 vote that's required for that. Adam, anything to add to those? All right, so that's a quick rundown of the approval requirements. So in conversations, other things have come up that we just wanted to make sure we acknowledged. The idea of establishing a joint powers authority, otherwise known as a JPA. Often this is, for example, would be with a school district. Legal says that it's unlikely that a library measure would fit within the definitions. I took out all the sub bullet points because we are trying to keep this move this along, but there are a lot of requirements on exactly how a library would have to fit, and it's unlikely that a standalone library building like this one would fit into a JPA situation with a school district. Private public partnerships. For example, we know that Burbank is exploring one of these. They did get some grant funding, and so they're looking at how to supplement that with private public partnerships. They're in early days of that, so we'll sort of be keeping an ear out on that. We also wanted to acknowledge that it is possible to add value, if not actually like completely remodel or replace a building based on naming rights, sponsorships. It's more likely that you can add value to it. And so this sort of smaller donations that would go towards specific building features, like a Carillon Tower or something like that, for example, it's more likely than for an entire structure. I didn't have time to put it on the slide, but I did take a quick look also at the Whittier Public Library, which was fairly recently remodeled, and the write-up I found when it reopened, basically it was that funding was pieced together in 6- and 7-figure amounts to make around a $17 million total. It was not all from one source, so it was they jigsawed that all together to make that one happen. Okay, so some potential timelines to keep in mind. Obviously, surveying is the public, as you saw, the school district did this. So surveying the public to find out their receptivity towards different proposals. If we're just going for ask about one proposal, then it takes about 50 days to mount and to collect and to get the report back on that survey. It takes about 10 days longer if you're going to compare a variety of proposals. Those would be different samples of the population that would be answering those questions, statistically comparable samples of the population. As for the actual election deadlines themselves for a citizen proposed initiative, if we're looking at November 2024 election, it's recommended that what they call the notice of intention be filed by December 22nd of 2023. So a little bit later this month, if a citizen is going to propose that. If for a city proposed initiative, again, for November of 2024 election, the last day that the city council can call that election and transmit their resolution is August 9th of 2024. So there are lots of other dates in between and all around those, but those are a few key ones to keep in mind. All right, so we're coming to you just with a variety of recommendations, really sort of questions. This is about what you want to communicate to council, whether or not you are, in support of a ballot measure to pay for improvements or remodeling of the library building, or potentially the library building in combination with other city facilities. So that's one thing to consider and possibly to communicate to council. The polling and funding options in terms of like what funding level, if you want to talk about that, and also the scope of the facilities that would be included. Again, just the library or multiple buildings. And this can go for, when you poll, obviously you need to know what you're asking about. That's why those are listed there. And finally, recommendations as far as fund allocations, because there are probably going to be professional services needed for things like if we want to ask about more than one funding proposal of the public, that is going to increase the serving costs and survey costs. And then obviously architectural options, if we want to pay for professional services to come up with some of those. And then there may be other information gathering that's needed to support public education that the city can provide to help the public understand what the pros and cons of everything are. So, Adam, anything to add?
Probably public comment and ask some questions. I know you and I have been talking a lot. I think it's important to know this is, as we sort of said in the intro, we've been before this body and before the city council a couple of times with status update on both the facility and funding options, which is why we went the state grant approach. And even in that, the city would have had to come up with between $4 and $5 million to even get a status quo if the state would have provided us as much grant funding as they could. So this isn't one of those things where we can cut here and cut there and come up with funding for a building that's $50 million plus. It's just not how the city's finances work in this day and age. So hopefully we provide some perspective on how we got here. And so really what we're looking at is a very large need. This issue with the library, the structural concerns, the raining inside the building, which is not a great feature, has been decades coming. And we're at that point now where we need to make a decision. It's a difficult decision one way or the other, but we are at that point. So with that, happy to answer any questions with Janet and hear any public testimony that we have.
I would like to open public comment. If you are in attendance, please fill out a speaker card and submit it to the recording administration before the close of the public comment period. Once recognized, speakers should advance to the podium, state your name and the subject matter you wish to discuss. If you are participating via Zoom, please select raise hand icon in Zoom before the close of the public comment period. Once recognized, you will be unmuted. State your name and the subject matter you wish to discuss. Are there any public comment cards?
I haven't received any. Anybody here at the audience would like to give public comment? Okay, we have none, and then I have nobody on Zoom.
Okay. So. Okay, then I would like to close the public comment period. Any of the Library Board of Trustees have any comments or would like to discuss or express any concerns or suggestions?
I'd like to discuss the public versus, a citizen proposed notice of intent to file. Could we talk a little bit about what that would entail if somebody on the Glendora Library Board would be able to file? And what all that, what that would mean?
So for a citizen initiated petition or measure to be submitted, the first step will really be to prepare the notice of intent and to get that filed before December 22nd. Because of Glendora's population and the number of voters, there's a minimum of one signature is required to sponsor the notice of intent, up to 3 signatures. After that, there is a time frame in which we'll take that initiative, we'll submit it to the city attorney, and he will look at the title that's being proposed and do an analysis. And then as long as that is good, then it would go on to the next step. There's not particularly a drop dead deadline for legally for notices of intent, but to ensure that we have enough time to go through the entire process, the Los Angeles County recommended that the notice of intent be filed before the 22nd.
Kathleen, can you talk a little bit about official status, job title, elected, appointed title, and acting as your own private citizen?
So when you do the notice of intent, it can come from pretty much any, it could come from the foundation, it can come from the library board. You are allowed to file the notice of intent with your commission or the trustee status or title. That is allowable. The city's participation through that process has to be educational only. Staff cannot participate or support that initiative from an administrative standpoint. Normally what we would see happen is a small group would put forward the notice of intent, and then they would reach that larger group who will be assisting with collecting signatures and walking through the rest of that process.
I would just add a little bit to that. Regardless if it was a city-sponsored initiative or a citizen initiative, the city can only take a role in education. So similar to this evening, where we are talking about a set of facts as it relates to the building and timelines and events and outreach, and you can talk about doing polling. Those are all factual information that you put out publicly that can be shared. The city can't take an advocating approach, meaning sending out mailers advocating for the passage of a measure. But a council member, for example, could use the title council member to sign a statement in support of a measure or against a measure for that matter. So, and people can use their past titles as a former appointed or a former elected official. And it could also be a resident that uses their title of their business owner or what have you. So really the big point is advocating in your official capacity as an appointed, elected, or city official.
I think I heard was then as a member of the library board, then any one of us or up to any 3 of us would be able to sponsor a citizen initiative.
To that extent, you'd probably want to stay away from the 3 number just for all intents and purposes with Brown Act. Heaven forbid people think that, but you know, that's just trying to be as a conservative in that approach. If that is some way that people move forward.
That seems reasonable. Yeah. Is that something Can I propose that question to the other board members? Is this something that we would support? That we would look to sign?
I would be interested in signing it just to get everything going to be investigated.
I would too. Yeah. Do we have consensus here?
That would be a yes for me. I would be in support of that.
Same, I would be in support.
I also would be in support.
It sounds like we would like to move forward with a citizen sponsored notice of intent. Is that something that you could help us?
Unfortunately, I can't provide any sort of legal advice. What I could do is get a sample for you and send that to you, provide you, and I can also provide you with the website. I can get the county information where their information outlines what everything that will need to be done.
Okay.
We can do that.
Yeah, and similar to anyone else who would come into the clerk's office to ask questions about process, we could share documents and so on and so forth. So that's available to any person that would come into City Hall.
I mean, I would see that as the first step, just to ensure that we could continue this discussion, right, for the November 2024 ballot. The other thing that we would like to talk about, I'd like to talk about, is the survey proposal, how we'd want to move forward with these survey proposals. So this is something that, as a board, we would be recommending to City Council. Is that correct? For when they meet again in January?
Yes. So with the proposal, Jenna, do you mind talking about the different types of polling that there may be depending on the type of situation? I think this may help the board provide some recommendations.
Sure. So basically, if there's one funding scenario that you want to ask the public about the receptivity, that's they can just do that. I think it was the 50-day timeline. They basically just run one survey with a statistically methodologically selected sample of the population. However, the moment you want to ask about a couple of different types of scenarios, however they might vary, if it's just in dollar amounts or if it's in one facility versus multiple facilities, when you start getting variations and you want to find out how they compare, the advice from the company that the city often works with for its surveying of this kind is that you really need to ask the separate samples of the population, because as soon as you put a couple of things on a single list, the ones that follow the first question, the answers are always skewed. So you don't get an accurate reading of what the receptivity is. So that's when they do what they call a multiple sample survey, and they would just ask each segment of the population, again identified to be representative of Glendora. They would ask them each about a different funding proposal, but the answers should be comparable based on the methodology of selecting the people that they ask, and then you can find out sort of where the sweet spots are in terms of support.
And we have funding for either option.
We have funding certainly for single sample, and the multiple sample is more costly. We don't think it's going to be prohibitive. We would encourage, if you really wanted to recommend that to council, that you would that's an action that you could take, is to voice your collective support for that, that they allocate those funds.
Would that require a motion or just consensus of the board here?
We can take, as long as you guys are all in agreement, if someone says if there's any opposition and there's no opposition, then we could definitely take that feedback to the council. So it would be, on that front, and then also looking, hey, do you want the city to pursue some architectural drawings as to what it could look like? Not actual drawings, but some renderings moving forward based on input, because there's a lot of that aspect too. So we would be looking for your feedback in that arena as well.
I think collecting data on different ideas or different plans is the most ideal. So I would be supportive of that decision as long as the city can provide funding for it.
A couple of different proposals then, one in terms
Yeah.
of what, surveying what level of funding would gain support and another one of what type of, or the scope
Yeah,
of what that funding would cover,
yeah.
those two types of surveys.
I think those are both very important things that we need to take into consideration and see what the citizens want.
I agree.
I would recommend that we recommend as a body to council to move forward with it.
Do we need to do a motion? Okay.
I don't sound there's no opposition to that approach. Doesn't sound
No,
like?
I just have one question. For the Riverside Library, because you were involved in the process, how was the funding for the Riverside Library acquired?
Well, it just so happens that Assistant City Manager Moises Lopez is in the house tonight, who actually built the library that was there with his own hands. Which is why he's here now. Moises, do you mind coming up and sharing a little bit about Measure Z? So, which is the sales and use tax the city used to help finance. I mean, to put it in perspective, Measure Z brings in how much revenue a year for the city?
I think they're up to about $90 million a year.
Then that's a use tax. That's like our Measure E, but a quarter cent more with a much larger tax base. So you want to talk a little bit about how that building was funded and done and talked about and so on and so forth?
Sure. So much like, well, good evening, board, Moses Lopez, Assistant City Manager. Much like the discussion that we're currently having, Riverside had a very, 2-decade-long discussion about what to do with its main library, whether to invest in the building that they had at that time or make the difficult decision to acquire a piece of property somewhere in the downtown area and build a new library. Ultimately, after an assessment, conducting an assessment of their existing facility, the determination was made that, much of the building was not usable for what the library wanted to be in the future. Not unlike our situation, much of the basic mechanical, electrical, and plumbing equipment of the facility was original, which requires a substantial amount of money just to bring it up to current day code requirements. And so the city council, after a very difficult discussion with the community, ultimately decided to build a new library and allocate $43 million to its construction. That project is complete. It's in operation now. As part of that particular project, a museum facility moved into the old main library building, and as part of that conversion process, the city fundraised $13 million to convert that space from a library facility that was constructed in 1950s into the museum facility that it is today. A good chunk of that money was spent fixing the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing equipment in that facility and HVAC requirements that would be required for a museum facility. So not too dissimilar to the condition that we're currently experiencing with our library. We need to make a significant investment into the building just to bring it up to current day standards. And, as we've talked about, the Building Forward grant would have basically given us a very expensive, nice facelift, but essentially keep the layout and structure as it currently exists. One added dimension that we didn't explore too much is that as we start spending money to bring up that facility to modern building code requirements, then we have to look at the entire envelope of the building, whether or not everything still is ADA compliant. And so that typically results in some additional expenditures that have to be made to upgrade that facility to modern day requirements. So mid-century buildings, as beautiful as they are, we're at a point where they're 50 and 60 years old and require some significant investment.
But fair to assume, just overall from funding, if Riverside had not passed the sales and use tax, there's no way that library would have been funded.
There's no way that library would have been funded.
Was that like a city initiated or a citizen initiated?
That was a city initiated. There were groups in the community that were very supportive of it and did a lot of the advocacy efforts. As the city clerk and city manager have mentioned, our role as public employees, we can only provide information and education relative to campaigns. So we can't educate or we can't advocate on behalf of anything. So other groups in the community took it upon themselves to kind of take on those activities.
And which museum moved in? To
The Cheech.
Okay, it was the Cheech.
Yes.
Okay, I thought. Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
So are we also supposed to provide direction on how to formulate the questions on the survey, or is the consultant, the people running the survey, going to do that?
Yes, the True North, which is the company the city works with, often has a lot of expertise in this kind of surveys. So they know the best way to formulate the actual questions. Of course, there will still need to be some discussions about the content of the questions, like what we are actually asking, but how to word them. They're on it. They're good.
I had one comment I wanted to make as a liaison from the Board of Library Trustees to the Glendora Public Library Friends Foundation. I did have a conversation about this with Maggie Lara, and you won't be surprised to know that they are very supportive. What role that they'll take in this, I'm sure that they'll be advocates for us when we get to that point. So I just wanted to say thank you to them for their participation and for always doing what they can in support of the library.
Anybody else have a comment? Then I could, otherwise I'll adjourn the meeting.
I just want to double check with Adam. Is there anything that would be useful? Anything else that would be useful in terms of the continuing conversation with council?
So it sounds like a lot of the feedback, and first of all, we appreciate you listening to us give the entire background. And while some of the information may not have been new because we've been able to have several conversations, it is a lot. So I think we have all the feedback necessary to the council on potentially looking at the type of initiative. We'll share with them the conversation this evening and also the recommendations from this body as it relates to moving forward with a sample or how we're going to do that and what have you. The only area that I would think that we may need some recommendation on is as it relates to future visioning as we go down this process. Would this group recommend the city find funding for the continued sort of architectural look at what a new library could look like from the outside, sort of the visioning aspect? Because one of the things, if people are like, hey, we're going to fund something, what am I spending money on? Well, we've done a great deal of work on functionality. I think from some of the architectural side of things, there's no windows on that building either, as Janet put it. So is there any recommendation from this board that have council direct staff to continue to pursue sort of the look and the feel as we walk down this path?
And if I can interject, just again, to reassure people that this would not be paying somebody to actually plan the new library, but it's concepts to help the public envision what that might mean for that space, right? So I just want to make sure we have that distinction, because I know there are people who would really want to be involved if indeed it comes to planning an expansion or a library. They want to be involved in the actual planning. That's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about expanding on these ideas so that people can really use their imaginations and understand what we're talking about.
I agree, and I thank you, Adam, for that reminder. Visuals are incredibly important for folks, and I think that we're going to have this conversation with the community and the community to have the conversation within itself over what we deserve as a city of Glendora. It's going to be vital to have that artist concept.
I was wondering for the wording that would be submitted for the city initiative, is that what would be on the ballot? And would the design have to be like presented at the same time as well?
I'll look at
That be
Kathleen.
voted on?
The important aspect is the naming and the verbiage on that front. the design on what it could look like is sort of the process that we've been undertaking as staff here. So it's like, hey, this is what funding would go is for. Here's kind of what it looks like. Here's the orientation to Glendora Avenue. Here's the expansion of the downtown. Here is the look and the feel of the civic complex. So
Normally that becomes part of that outreach to the community to try and get the support. The initiative itself is basically just a question that goes out to the community saying, do you want to fund a potentially new library, or whatever that question turns out to be? Or maybe it's two different questions. That happens now too. So it just depends. Sometimes the vision comes out to normally from the public for advocacy purposes, to help people understand what's possible.
When are we looking to run the survey? After it gets set out to city council?
So some of the feedback we'll take to get refined timelines from True North, but council will be updated in January. So shortly thereafter, we would look at trying to move forward with it. In terms of a timeline survey, Janet, do you happen to recall what the timeline is from Go?
Takes, if we're asking about multiple different scenarios, about 60 days.
So the survey will probably run anytime between like March to like June, like in that time launch.
No.
Actually, once it's designed, the actual survey time is very fast, because they specifically reach out to people who have been identified statistically to represent Glendora. So it's not a blanket sort of.
Right. So once city council approves it, they can start working on it right away.
Yes.
There's no.
May I go back and ask a question to Mr. Lopez?
Yeah, of course.
No, I sit in the back so I don't get questions.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, because as this meeting is continuing, it's starting to percolate with me that as an outsider looking in with the Riverside build on the library and the renovation on the Cheech, it seems from just the casual observer that building a new library from scratch seemed to be an easier endeavor than refurbishing the Cheech into the museum that it is now. So it seems like the Cheech, in trying to work with the multiple conditions of that vintage building, hit multiple obstacles that proved to be exceedingly costly, and a lot of delays were incurred. So can you speak to that?
Certainly. Old buildings are, we know they're old by virtue of their age. We know through our record keeping what has been improved or fixed over the years. And so we have a pretty good idea of the condition of a lot of that equipment. As with any old building, the moment you start digging a little deeper and moving a wall here or there, or trying to look at other elements of the building that you can't necessarily see without, putting a hole in it, you start discovering some other things that are potentially more problematic. And so on any project, I guarantee you, we will find something that we did not plan for, and we'll have to adjust our program scope to figure out whether or not it requires an additional investment. In the case of the Riverside example, that kind of worked out pretty well. The building, as boxy and as dark as it is, works perfectly for a museum.
It does.
Which, we didn't have to punch any walls for windows, which would have been a very big problem from a historical perspective or cultural heritage perspective as well. So that presented an opportunity that perhaps other conditions that wouldn't otherwise exist in other buildings. New projects are obviously very exciting because you get an opportunity to really envision from the ground up without being limited by the scale or scope of the existing envelope or building envelope. And so that does give us a little bit more creative flexibility to address the types of issues and create the types of spaces that we want in relationship to the street, and not just internal to the building, but external, how it sits on the Civic Center complex, the street, and all the plans that we have envisioned for Glendora Avenue. A lot of the work, thankfully, as part of this process has already been done. in terms of envisioning the spaces needed for certain elements of the library of the future. So we know from a square footage perspective what it is that we want and what we are looking towards in terms of improvements that would be associated with the investment that we chose to make. So some of that basic scale and scope concept is already developed for us. So when we go to an architect to say, hey, draw me a 47,000 square foot building that creates X number of spaces that are open, that have light, natural light, they're more capable of developing a schematic that appropriately reflects the work that we've already completed. So we've done a good chunk of the work that I think that we'll be able to leverage to create the concepts that we just talked about in a minute ago. But I think it presents some opportunities and challenges in both realms.
I'm just a little concerned that if construction were to begin, we could hit multiple obstacles and construction costs would be incurred and it would turn into more of a process than we were anticipating.
That's a perfectly valid concern.
Thank you. I appreciate your expertise.
Anybody else have any more comments or questions?
Want to make sure that we addressed all of these recommendations that we as a board are recommending to take back to city council, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Before I adjourn the meeting, I would like to wish everybody Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And wish Trustee Tolan a belated happy birthday. And wishing Carrie Johnson, Vice President Carrie Johnson, a happy birthday because today is her birthday.
Thank
So
you very much.
Thank you for coming. So I would like to adjourn the meeting at 6:15 p.m.